This is Eva Hussein from Polaron speaking to you from my home in Melbourne, where we are in lockdown. And before we came to speak to you live, we were just having a chat about how everyone's coping, and we are doing okay, in case you're wondering. On the other screen, you can see my colleague Nicholas, who is going to be talking to me today about co-designing translations. Good morning, Nicholas.
Hi, Eva. How are you going?
I am good. How are things with you? What's happening at your end?
Yeah, so down in the southeast, couple problem areas here with COVID, but I'm keeping well and safe at home. Just doing the day-to-day operations of Polaron. But yeah, look, managing. I think it's a strange time, a different one, but everyone has their own ways of coping, as we were talking about before. And I think, yeah, it's a changing landscape, but one that we're more accustomed to now.
And I hear on the grapevine that you've been super busy, and we're just about to hire like 87 people or whatever it is. No, just 2, but that's still a lot. So the work's been coming at us, and one of the things we're going to be talking about today is quality of translation. So what I wanted to start off with is you've obviously you've been part of this industry for quite some time, but you've obviously read some of the bad press that translation's been getting recently. What do you think about that? Tell us more.
Eva, it pains me to the deepest parts of my heart to hear that. We work in an industry that's obviously very subjective. You know, you've got thousands of interpreters and translators working daily on different resources through different clients, and there's obviously bound to be some cracks in the system. But basically what these articles are showing light on is the quality of translations and the quality of specific translations produced by government. Now, it pains me to the bottom of my heart because of the fact that I know these translations are being done, quite quickly with no real care of quality. What we're talking about here today is co-design translations. And I think what's happening in government currently and what's happening with the translations that are under the cosh is, the fact that they're not being taken care of by multiple parties, and they're being given to sole translators to work on and then simply being pushed through the conveyor belt. So that's what I see the problem being. And I think that, rightfully so, these organizations that are producing bad materials are, deservedly copying it, but there are ways around it. And I know the specific ways that we can overcome this. It's just a matter of, educating the clients and organizations that are producing poor material.
So we're going to talk about in a moment about how to do it better, but I always bring this down to people. So I know that you have Polish grandparents. I hope you don't mind me bringing them into the conversation.
No, that's fine.
And they've been, because it's always really good to reflect on why we even doing this translation stuff, right? So your grandparents, they're quite elderly now, but they've been in Australia for about 30 years, and they speak English, but maybe not as well as Polish. And when you look at how, firstly, and how they receive information, are there any comments that you could make just from your own backyard about that?
Yeah, definitely. Look, and you raise a really, really good point there. And although they came to Australia, 30 years ago, and they were developing and learning English, my grandparents aren't getting any younger. And as we get older and, specifically the elderly, they tend to go back to their native language, their native tongue. So although, yes, they do speak a little bit of English, my grandfather and grandmother are now speaking almost 100% Polish because it's easier for them. They're older and they struggle to find the words in English. So it's super, super difficult for them to find information, generally, let alone in the midst of a pandemic, okay? And typically where they reach out for their information is not on the HHS website. I'm sorry, it's not. They're not going to search up on their iPhone 6 or their laptop or whatever it is, because they don't have that, right? They're going to look for community links or community radio, community TV to find their information. And that's where the basis of what they learn and understand here in Australia, and especially about the pandemic, comes from those sources. So that's another thing that we need to talk about, and it's the dissemination of these resources being translated. Are they even reaching our communities? Are they reaching my grandmother and grandfather? You know, I don't really think so.
So why is it so, and if you explained it so well, but why is it so hard for our clients to understand that? Because part of what we do, and certainly part of what you do, is education, and you know, but it always feels like we're on the back foot of that conversation with some clients, where you know, you're trying to explain why you should do things in a certain way and why it makes a difference, but they still, some people still will go for box ticking or cheapest provider, or you know, as long as it looks Chinese, that's good enough. But why would you, let's say I was your prospective clients, what would you say to me to convince me to do it well? And what does it mean to do it well? Because there are, you know, there's no recipe, right? So translation is, you know, what I often say is that you're only as good as your last translation. I strongly believe that, because, you know, I still work as a translator. My work gets checked. Why? Because it'll improve the final quality. But of course, in CoDesign translations, which you take us through in a moment, we start with the community. And what I'd like you to tell us is why we do that. And also, what are some of the challenges of trying to explain that to people, and why we are now saying to people, listen, yes, you can engage an individual translator. With all due respect, some of them, most of them are fantastic and they produce a good quality of work, but you are exposing yourself to risk. And given COVID, we are seeing like systemic cracks in the system where really, you know, people shouldn't even be providing translation. They should be doing something else. So tell us what it is.
Yeah, you're spot on there. It is a form of box ticking, and it is that systematic, you know, cracks in the system that we're talking about here. More often than not, clients and organizations are obviously bound by time and cost. So they will typically go for this standard run-of-the-mill translation. We are bound by NADI certification, so at least that's there, but it's not a complete and whole quality assurance measure. It is a form of it, but there are other aspects to it. What I would typically say to a client is that we can't just go through our translations hoping that one translator is going to do the job. Yes, they are qualified, and yes, this is their job, but people make mistakes. There are things like human error. You know, even you and I, we work very, very hard, you know, long hours. And once we get to the end of our shift, we may not be working at 100% as we were at the start of our shift, right? It's the same with translators. That's why what we're talking about here, and what I like to pitch to clients, is co-design translations, right? And now what co-design translation does is it eliminates the risk potential that you were talking about there. It eliminates the fact that we're relying on the sole translator, and it allows us to encompass community at the first stage before even sending off translations. Now, the benefit of doing this is that we get to realize what the actual source text can be and how we can, you know, manipulate it and develop it in a way so that it speaks to the community with more quality, with more longevity and more impact, right? Because ultimately, yes, we can translate, but we want to be able to disseminate a message that's meaningful and actually gets to the community. Like I was mentioning, my grandmother and grandfather, there's no point just putting something out there hoping that, you know, it'll fall through. We need to actually get our community resources, develop it with translation in such a way that it's actually going to reach the community.
And sometimes those conversations with not just prospective clients or clients, but also translators and interpreters are difficult, because everyone's very proud of their craft, and you know, like the co-design aspect of things is actually quite difficult to achieve, because you mentioned earlier that it is subjective and everyone's got a slightly different way of working, or you know, sometimes you have put so much work into your translation, and then you receive it with feedback that you might not agree with. But I think what we promote and what we advocate is to go to the communities and learn about who they are, right?
Yeah.
Who they are, what do they want, and how do they want that information to be given to them? Because it's, you know, there are lots of different methods, and nowadays it's so easy and so inexpensive to do things differently. So I'm wondering whether you could now take us through that process from start to finish. So if I'm your client, I come to you and I go, I need to talk to, you know, people in southeast of Melbourne about mental health. Like, what would you be advising me to do?
Perfect. Yep. So first and foremost, I am going to understand what the needs are. And you've mentioned here mental health in the Southeast. Now, first and foremost, I'm going to tell you that community is pivotal in disseminating your information. And whether or not you like to hear that, it does come with a cost and it does come with a bit of time. However, if you're serious about delivering your translations and doing them properly, you'll agree with me in this case, right?
Yes, Nicholas.
The community in the Southeast, and we find the languages and the cultures that are out there, right? So typically you can pick the top 5 or the top 10, or if you're an amazing client, you'll pick the top 50. But we pick the core languages that we're looking to target. And we reach out to ethno-specific organizations and community leaders in a group. And basically we consult with them on your current source document. In some cases, you may not have a source document ready, in which we can help co-design that translation even further and develop the resource with the community leaders. And what that basically looks like, it's a roundtable discussion with the community leaders and their organizations, and we get through all the nitty-gritty. Now, Eva, I'm sure you've got plenty of examples, but there's some examples on my end as well, where we look at a resource and we go, are the text being used appropriate? What kind of imagery can we use in order to make it more meaningful? What resonates better with, for example, the Chinese community? You've got a good story about, I think, Quit Victoria that we did a few years back, where we, had a few different communities that we were targeting, and that changed the resource depending on which community we were.
Right. Because at the end of the day, what Quit Victoria wanted us to do is reach into the communities and learn about their smoking habits, educational level, literacy levels, but also how to help them stop smoking. That is the ultimate aim. So when we look at co-design translations, we ask ourselves, okay, what is it that we're producing? What are we going to use it for? What's the measurable outcome? Because you can measure some of it quite effectively, but also reach into the community to ask them, how do they prefer to receive their information? Is it a website? Is it a video? Is it a podcast? Is it brochures at the community center? And each of the communities will be slightly different in ways that I've just described. And of course, yes, it is more work, and yes, it is more cost. But I think what we need to ask ourselves, okay, how much does it cost not to do it? Because I think sometimes people end up with resources that no one reads, or they gather dust somewhere, or they're not culturally appropriate even. So things like images. So what you want is for the person that you developing this stuff for to pick it up, to be engaging, to be interested, and to help them in whatever. So let's say it's mental health. We know that in some communities that comes with a lot of stigma. We know that in some communities, people aren't familiar with the mental health system in Australia. So you need to know before you even start developing anything about what the community knows, where they at on that spectrum of understanding what we can offer, and how to make whatever we're producing in terms of information relatable, so that if I am I don't know, a Chinese speaking community, probably I want to pick up a brochure that has someone looking like me on it, not looking like me as in not a blonde blue-eyed person, whatever. So there are little things that you can do to make it more culturally appropriate, and you can look at ways that we produce that information for certain communities, because we know that there are communities that don't have high literacy rates, and educational levels are also quite low. So there's not even any point in developing a straight translation, is it?
Yep, that's exactly right. And look, we learn to understand all of that at the community consultation point of that process. And you'll discover what the needs are of the community. And you've mentioned a really important thing there. It's cultural appropriateness. We look at, for example, and I'm going to pull this community in, but the South Sudanese community, who may not have a high literacy in their Dinka or their Nuer language, but may prefer to receive an audio or a video of, voiceover, because they've got a low literacy level in their own language. When we're looking at community consultation at that first step, we're also looking at the medium in which we can produce these resources. Like you've mentioned, a straight translation is not always going to be best. In some instances, we need to produce audio, or we need to produce visuals for people to to understand what's happening in the video a little bit more. So all of this happens for one main reason, and it's so that we can get it all culturally appropriate, right? That's the biggest thing that we're trying to achieve here, because when it comes to translations, sometimes if we're doing them just standard and popping out translations on a website, they're not going to be culturally sensitive and can offend communities in some instances. So we need to look at that. The next few parts are impact, longevity, and then the quality of it. Those three factors are also really, really important and are helped to become an actual outcome with this community consultation. So that all happens in the first instance, and it's obviously the longest part of the process, and it's one of the reasons why clients, don't typically receive this product if they're due, if they've got a strict time or cost barrier. But we really like to employ this at the start of a process, and then we move on to our translations from there. Now, obviously, we're applying 90 certified translators where possible. I'm pretty sure everyone knows this step. More often than not, you can also employ an independent checker in this process. So they review the translation after it's been completed. They review it for things like grammatical issues, terminology, consistency, fluency, all of these, linguistic factors. The best thing about a CoDesign translation is we don't just leave the community at the start there and take all of their advice and run away with it. The next best part about this is that we get to bring them back in at the end of the process, where not only are they reviewing the full translation for its terminology and appropriateness, but they're also going to help with dissemination. And now this brings me back to grandma and grandpa again, in that dissemination is, 50 to almost 80% of your strategy. You really need to focus on this part, because we can produce the best resource in the world with you. If you're not going to look at how it's being disseminated, it's not going to reach anyone, and therefore it's going to have no impact. So what we do with communities is we reach out, we use ethno-specific organizations that help us reach out to the people you're trying to target. So if we're talking mental health in the Southeast, we would be looking at cultural organizations that have dealt with this in the past, dealt with mental health, or have some sort of social setting, and are able to influence and impact those people in the community that may be affected by the issue. That is one of the key parts of co-designing your translation, is that dissemination. And I think, Eva, you can agree with me there. There's no point doing all of this if we're not going to disseminate it right.
Right. And I think what you described sounds easy, but easy, no, it sounds simple, but it's never easy. Creating something that's simple is never easy.
Correct.
And that is because you do have to negotiate, when we talk about culture and language, it's so can be very opaque and can be very emotional and very subjective. So, sometimes clients will ask us, oh, well, but which community leader can I trust, or which community organization should I go by? So if you the steps that you've described are just the tip of the iceberg. So I think behind the scenes, there's probably 50 different steps in terms of the quality and how all that's managed, and the feedback and the input. That's so much more than what we're able to describe in the next 12 minutes. But I think, it is about having that trust with community organizations that we work with, and community leaders and translators. So it is a collaborative effort, and it is a co-designed, conversation, I guess, even I would call it that. And there are many, many benefits of producing something like that along the way. But of course, like you said, not everyone's got the time or the money. But I wonder then whether it's sometimes, and we do sometimes tell clients not to bother, right? Because if you're not going to do that, more likely than not, you're going to end up with something less than good. And it might do a job, but it might also do quite a bit of damage. So there's quite a bit of risk around not having at least one level of quality around translation. Or at least having at least one checker or one independent person that's going to look at it, because mistakes do happen, don't they?
That's exactly right. And look, I think when we're talking about the steps in the background, you are right. There are many, many, many steps. And just with the additional languages that we include in projects, it creates multiple people we're dealing with. So yes, you're talking about, simple but not easy. And that's why there is a cost associated with co-design translations. more often than not, clients do want the best translations for the lowest price. And I'll be honest with you and all the clients, sometimes it's not possible. And that's why we do turn away some customers and say, look, we can't help you with this campaign because we know that we're not going to deliver what your audience needs. But when we get down to it, and when we get down to the importance and the opportunity cost, really, if we're going to take on that risk and not employ any kind of quality checking, even if it's that one you're talking about, just one step in there that's going to help improve quality, then we're really going to work out that the cost is going to be far greater to the community and to the actual organization producing those materials than it would have been to take the time to do things properly in the first instance. Now, I think you can speak on this, but there have been instances where we've seen where translations have gone out without this community approval, and we've seen the real cost of it. Organizations are copping a lot of heat for it. Not only that, but we're in a current pandemic where a majority of cases are coming from the cold communities. And why is that? Because it wasn't done right the first time round. So I think when we're talking about quality, we're not talking about bags of money you need to throw into your translations, but we're talking about doing it right the first time round. I don't know if you agree with me there, but that's definitely my stance on it, and that's what I see.
Absolutely. I think there's no other way of putting it. And I think, look, the other thing that we've been emphasizing for a long time is that we do need to support local translators. So, yes. It's a competitive market. There's plenty of competition around, and, in Australia, outside of Australia. And at the end of the day, it does have to be a value-based conversation rather than money-based conversation. But I would say to people that are considering translation that first of all, you need to learn how it works, and not everybody wants to hear about how translation works because it's a difficult conversation, and maybe it's a bit boring, and maybe it's a bit controversial, and you really need to get into it to give it your best shot. Because I guess it's also fair to say that most people just want to look at things. Oh yeah, that looks Arabic to me. That's fine, but it doesn't work like that because you are not really reaching into the community with your message. And best case scenario is that nothing happens and nobody says anything. But worst case scenario, where it really embarrasses you as an organization, but also creates risks for the communities. And we are seeing it through the bad press, the bad media, particularly in Australia. And, I hear things like, well, but, isn't SBS producing materials in other languages? Well, no, not really. So you kind of have to describe and explain basic things. Because I think, the industry for too long also hid behind the NATI accreditation, as it was called. And, as a NATI certified translator, I am telling you, that my work needs to be checked. There's no shame about it, but the checking process also needs to be managed to the extent that it improves the quality of the work rather than nitpick or we don't want opinions. We want quite scientific way of describing the problem in English, and then we can all work towards improving it. But just because we've got a couple of minutes left, what I was going to ask you, Nicholas, is just briefly describe 5-step of co-designed translation from start to finish.
Okay, 5 simple steps on how we do it. So first step is to reach out to the community in the first instance, okay? We are going to figure out your aims. We're going to figure out the objectives, the outcomes that we will achieve, how best we're going to plan this translation out, right? First step. Second step is then taking that information and feedback to our NATI certified translator, right? And you just said it. Yes, you're a NATI certified translator, but you do think that quality checking will improve your translation. And there's no doubt in that. Look, it doesn't, there's no stigma behind it. We're allowed to say it as translators that it will improve the translation. So then once we've got our second step out of the way, we've done that, which is usually the time consuming part, translating as well. We then look to employ a secondary checker, right? Now, this secondary checker is going to review the translation for its quality, its fluency, terminology, all of that. And upon completion, we're passing that back to the translator. And this is what Eva was talking about, that there's that numerous feedback loop that we're always going through to assure quality, okay? And after that third step has been completed, we are then passing the translation on to the community leaders again. and the ethno-specific organizations that are reviewing it for its cultural appropriateness. Once again, its terminology. And then we're passing that back to the translator, right? They approve that translation, and then we've got a final copy. The fifth and probably most important step is what I was talking about, dissemination. Now we go back to the community, we consult with them, and we say, okay, what's the best plan moving forward for how we can get this information out there? And then we work with them, we produce, all different kinds of reports on how we're going to do that. The client themselves, also with CoDesign translations, get traceability reports at this last step, which shows you who's worked on your translations. So there's 5 simple steps there, but it shows you the kind of transparency you get, firstly, with working with us and working with CoDesign translations. But it's also going to show you the amount of people involved in this translation. And like we were saying before, even if it's just 1 in the step or 2 or 3, the more we get working on it, the more we can be sure of the quality. If we go out there with 1 translator, we're never going to be sure. There could be mistakes, there could be issues. But if we've got a full team behind your translation, you can say safely that those translations have been checked and have got great quality surrounding them. So those are the 5 steps, and those are how those 5 steps lead to good quality translations.
That's great. That was a very well explained process from start to finish. So we've got about 4 minutes for questions. So I'll hand over to Andrea, and we'll see what our audience wants to know.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent discussion. So we have quite a few questions from the audience. First question, with COVID, information often needs to be published quickly. Do you have any advice on how to go about getting useful information out quickly while ensuring it is relevant?
Yeah.
Nicholas, did you want to take that one?
I would love to. Look, although information does need to be put out there quickly, there's no reason why you can still not, you cannot go for a quality checking process in there. You don't necessarily have to go to the extreme lengths of CoDesign translations, but you can still go for community checking or independent checking on your translations, even just putting a buffer of quality checking within your translations. I know one client we work for at the moment is a city council, and they produce resources frequently in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, but they also need it out there fast. Now, these guys work with us and do a full CoDesign community approved translation process, right? And they still manage to get it by because 1, they understand the value in the product and they're not scared by the price tag associated with it. 2, they understand the needs of the community. The community doesn't need any more misinformation or any more poor translations. They know that the community needs real translations with real quality and real cultural appropriateness and impact. So those 2 factors alone are what push clients and organizations to I guess, thrive in terms of translations under this current pandemic. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Eva.
Yeah, I do actually, because I think there's 2 things I wanted to add. Thank you, Nicholas. One is that for that particular client and many of our other clients, all it means is that they have a plan.
Yeah.
Like it's not an afterthought, it's not a last minute thing. So yes, you need to be flexible, and yes, you might need to deliver things faster or whatever, but there's a plan in place. And secondly, we do need to nowadays look into more innovative solutions, ones that are still good, but it might be a recording, it might be a podcast, it might be a video. And, to bring it to market faster, we need to look at the source that clients are giving us. So if they're going to give us a brochure of 50 pages and they want it, put into InDesign and make it pretty, that's not going to happen fast. So we have to sometimes go back to them and say, you know what, great, but how about you consider this other way of actually making this information quickly available to your community? And we're not talking about cutting corners in terms of quality, but what we're talking about is developing solutions for now, not tomorrow, not in 2 weeks, not in 3 months' time. And people, most people just want to know, how much, who, when, how, right? So you don't need to translate your vision and mission statements or your website, or it's about looking at what information do you want to communicate and how to do it quickly whilst maintaining the quality.
Yeah, spot on.
One last question, guys. What sort of support does Polaron provide in the dissemination stage?
So we've got about, I think maybe 80 to 90 organizations that we work with that are our community partners. So we talk to them about what works for them. And just having them engaged in the process means that they already know that there are quick resources or mental health resources. So they will disseminate this information without asking, but we often work with them on a strategy that's that's really well incorporated into the strategy or the plan that the client might have. So we can support them through ideas, through networks, and also through community leaders that are trusted and ones that are, able to, I would say, penetrate the community in a very useful way. And it's a journey, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. And it is about you learning who you're working with, who the communities are, what do they want, what do they need, and how can you talk to them in a meaningful way. I think that sincere, meaningful way is what I would leave everybody with as a message, because it is really the only way that's respectful and useful and carries your message into the community in a way that will work for everyone. All right, so can I take this opportunity to take Nicholas to take time out of his busy day? And I know that working from home's pretty hard right now, but I think, everyone appreciates your depth of understanding. And I think if you have grandparents that are, in a situation that many of our sort of end users are, it gives you a really good perspective. So I wanted to thank you. Say hello to Babcia and Jadek, of course. And any last words that you want to share with us?
No, I think I'll leave it with those two words that you put at the end there: sincere and quality. So let's roll with that. And I want all of our clients and prospects and everyone out there to remember those two important factors when talking about translations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Andrea. And we'll see you next week. And we're going to be talking about something else very, very exciting as usual, hopefully. See you everyone. Have a great day.
See you guys.
Bye.